and talk to me.
For the record, you are guilty of killing many women and girls. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
Ted, how did it happen? Take me back. What are the antecedents of the behavior that we've seen? So much grief, so much sorrow, so much pain for so many people. Where did it start? How did this moment come about?
I grew up in a wonderful home with two dedicated and loving parents, one of 5 brothers and sisters. But as a young boy, and I mean a boy of 12 or 13, certainly, that I encountered outside the home again, in the local grocery store, the local drugstore, the softcore pornography, what people call softcore. But as I think I explained to you last night, Dr. Dobson, in an anecdote, that as young boys do, we explored the back roads and sideways and byways of our neighborhood, and oftentimes people would dump the garbage and whatever they were cleaning out of their house, and from time to time we'd come across pornographic books of a harder nature than more graphic, you might say, more explicit nature than we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that?
It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible. To wake up in the morning and realize what I had done, and with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment, absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
You really hadn't known that before?
Basically, I was a normal person. I wasn't some guy hanging out at bars or a bum, or I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with him, and just tell. I was essentially a normal person. I had good friends. I led a normal life, except for this one small but very potent and very destructive segment of it that I kept very secret and very close to myself and didn't let anybody know about it. And part of the shock and horror for my dear friends and family years ago when I was first arrested was that there was no clue. They looked at me and they looked at the all-American boy, and I wasn't perfect, but I want to be quite candid with you. I was okay. I was. The basic humanity and basic spirit that God gave me was intact, but unfortunately it became overwhelmed at times. And I think people need to recognize that it's not some kind of those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media in particular, pornographic violence are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons and we are your husbands. And we grew up in regular families. And pornography can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today. He snatched me out of my home. It snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. And as diligent as my parents were, and they were diligent in protecting their children, and as good a Christian home as we had, and we had a wonderful Christian home, there is no protection against the kinds of influences that are loose in a society that tolerates.
You feel this really deeply, don't you? Ted, outside these walls right now, there are several hundred reporters that wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
And you asked me to come here from California because you had something you wanted to say. This hour that we have together is not just an interview with a man who's scheduled to die tomorrow morning. I am here and you're here because of this message that you're talking about right here. You really feel that hardcore pornography and the doorway to it, softcore pornography, is doing untold damage to other people and causing other women to be abused and killed the way you did others.
Listen, I'm no social scientist, and I haven't done a survey. I mean, I don't pretend that I know what John Q. Citizen thinks about this. But I've lived in prison for a long time now. And I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's real. It's true.
Ted, what would your life have been like without that influence? You can only speculate.
Yeah. Well, I know it would have been far better, not just for me, and it's, excuse me for being so self-centered here. It would have been a lot better for me and lots of other people. I know that. Lots of other innocent people, victims and families. It would have been a lot better. There's no question, but it would have been a fuller life. Certainly a life that would not have involved, I'm absolutely certain, would not have involved this kind of violence that I have committed.
I'm sure, Ted, if I were able to ask you the questions that are being asked out there, one of the most important as you come down to perhaps your final hours, are you thinking about all those victims out there and their families who are so wounded, years later, their lives have not returned to normal. They will never return to normal.
Absolutely.
Are you carrying that load, that weight? Is the remorse there?
Yes, absolutely. In the past few days, myself and a number of investigators have been talking about unsolved cases, murders that I was involved in. And it's hard to talk about all these years later because it revives in me all those terrible feelings and those thoughts that I have steadfastly and diligently dealt with, I think successfully, with the love of God. And yet it's reopened that, and I felt the pain and I felt the horror again of all that. And I can only hope that those who I have harmed, those who I've caused so much grief, even if they don't believe my expression of sorrow and remorse, will believe what I'm saying now, that there is loose in their towns and their communities people like me today whose dangerous impulses are being fueled day in and day out by violence in the media in its various forms, particularly sexualized violence. And what scares me, and let's come into the present now, because what I'm talking about happened 30 years ago, that is, in my formative stages. And what scares and appalls me, Dr. Dobson, is when I see what's on cable TV, some of the movies, I mean, some of the violence in the movies that come into homes today with stuff that they wouldn't show in X-rated adult theaters 30 years ago. This stuff...
The slasher movies that you're talking about.
That stuff is, I'm telling you, from personal experience, the most, that is graphic violence on screen, particularly as it gets into the home to children who may be unattended or unaware that they may be a Ted Bundy who has that vulnerability to that predisposition to be influenced by that kind of behavior, by that kind of movie, that kind of violence. There are kids sitting out there switching the TV dial around and come upon these movies late at night, or I don't know when they're on, but they're on and any kid can watch them. It's scary when I think what would have happened to me if I had seen. I mean, it's scary enough. I mean, that I just ran into stuff outside the home, but to know that children are watching that kind of thing today, or can pick up their phone and dial away for it or send away for it. But I'll tell you, there are lots of other kids playing in streets around this country today who are going to be dead tomorrow and the next day and the next day and next month because other young people are reading the kinds of things and seeing the kinds of things that are available in the media today.
Ted, as you would imagine, there's tremendous cynicism about you on the outside, and I suppose for good reason. I'm not sure that there's anything that you could say that people would believe. Some people would believe.
Yeah.
And yet, you told me last night, and I've heard this through our mutual friend John Tanner, that you have accepted the forgiveness of Jesus Christ and are a follower and a believer in Him. Do you draw strength from that as you approach these final hours?
I do. I can't say that
It's going to be
being
easy.
in the valley of the shadow of death is something that I've become all that accustomed to, and that I'm strong and nothing's bothering me. Listen, it's no fun. It gets kind of lonely, and yet I have to remind myself that every one of us will go through this someday, in one way or another, and countless millions who have walked this earth before us have. So this is just an experience which we all share.
Yeah.
Here I am.